Betrayal does not thunder into your life. It arrives quietly, like a splinter under the skin, and by the time you notice, the wound is already festering. My name is Edward Halbrook. I am 71 years old, though my bones sometimes tell me I've lived longer. For most of my life I've been a craftsman. Wood, stone, and steel have been my language. I built homes for other families, carved staircases that creaked under children's feet, laid floors that bore witness to wedding dances and wake vigils alike. It's honest work, and though it never made me rich, it gave me a pride no coin could buy. My wife passed 7 winters ago, and since then I've lived with my daughter, Margaret, or rather, she allowed me to live under her roof. At least that's how she likes to phrase it these days. The first hints came softly enough. A sigh when she set my cup of tea down, a clipped answer when I asked after her day. Small things you could explain away with stress or distraction. I wanted to believe it was just the wear and tear of her own responsibilities, but over time, the sighs sharpened into scowls, the clipped answers into biting words. And then came the bills. Always the bills. She would lay them flat on the kitchen table, right where my breakfast plate sat, as if the paper itself was seasoning for my eggs. The gas went up again, she'd mutter, sliding the envelope toward me without meeting my eye. Or, "You know, Dad, groceries don't buy themselves." She never asked. She demanded through implication, through tone, through that quiet pressure that leaves you feeling smaller by the day. I remember one morning in particular. The sun hadn't yet lifted above the oaks outside, and the kitchen smelled of stale coffee. Margaret stood with her back to me, arms crossed, her robe frayed at the sleeve. "Dad," she said without turning, "you've been here almost 8 years now. You think that's easy on me?" Her voice carried no malice on the surface, only a weary resignation, but underneath I heard the blade being sharpened. I sat still, fingers tightening around my mug, saying nothing. Silence was the only armor I had in that moment. I told myself she didn't mean it. That grief had hardened her, that the strain of single motherhood had carved edges where there once was kindness. I even reminded myself of the child she had been, wide-eyed, clutching my hand at county fairs, asking endless questions about the world. It's a cruel trick, memory. It keeps you loyal to ghosts that no longer live in the people you love. The tension grew like a hairline crack in glass, invisible until the whole pane shatters. Margaret began dropping comments in front of her friends when they visited. "Dad's comfortable here," she'd say with a thin smile, as though I were some old stray she'd taken pity on. I caught the quick glances, the polite nods from her guests, and I swallowed the humiliation like bitter medicine. At night, alone in the small room at the end of the hall, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how it had come to this. A father reduced to an unwelcome guest in the house of his own child. The betrayal had not yet fully declared itself, but I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. Every small gesture carried weight. When she placed the grocery receipt on my bedside table, when she sighed at the sound of my chair scraping the floor, when she closed her door quickly after dinner, leaving me to the silence of the living room. None of these acts were cruel in isolation, but together they built a cage of contempt. One evening I overheard her on the phone. Her voice was hushed but sharp, each word cutting through the thin wall between her room and mine. "He doesn't contribute. Not enough, anyway. It's time he understands this isn't free." There was a pause, and then laughter, light, dismissive. My chest tightened as though a vice had closed around it. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my shoes, listening to the woman I had raised speak of me as if I were a tenant behind on rent. That night I lay awake, the ceiling fan turning shadows across the room. I thought of the years I spent building a life, the sacrifices made for her education, the nights I went without so she could have. All of it seemed to dissolve in the acid of her words, a lifetime of giving met with the cold arithmetic of debt and dues. My mind refused to let me sleep. It played her voice again and again until betrayal itself became a lullaby. I did not yet know how far she would go, but I felt it, an inevitability pressing closer, like the slow tick of a clock leading to midnight. I knew the day was coming when the splinter would break the skin wide open, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. When Margaret was small, she used to run barefoot across the porch I built with my own hands. She would trace her fingers over the grain of the wood, asking how trees could become something strong enough to hold us up. I'd tell her that wood carries memory, that every knot and line was a story from when it was alive. She'd listen wide-eyed, then throw herself into my arms with trust so complete it felt sacred. That memory kept me anchored for years, even as her tone toward me began to harden. I'd catch glimpses of that child in her still. The careful way she folded her son's shirts, the quiet pride she carried when he came home with good marks from school. But those moments grew rarer, drowned out by sighs, by impatience, by something colder that settled into the marrow of our relationship. I tried to excuse it. I told myself she was tired, that raising a boy on her own while holding down 2 part-time jobs had worn her thin. I thought of my late wife, how she had always worried Margaret was too quick to want more than she had. Maybe this was that seed, finally sprouting. Still, I clung to loyalty the way fathers do. The truth began to show in small slips. One afternoon I overheard her speaking to a neighbor. "It's not easy with Dad here. He doesn't, he doesn't bring much to the table." She said it with a little laugh, the kind you use to soften a blade. The neighbor murmured something polite, but the words lodged in me like shrapnel. From then on, I began to notice how she introduced me. Not as her father, not as the man who built the house she grew up in, but as Dad, who's staying with me for a while. As though I were a visitor who had overstayed his welcome. I'd nod, smile faintly, and excuse myself to the kitchen. Pride makes you quiet where anger wants to roar. The first true confrontation came on a stormy evening. Rain lashed against the windows, and the gutters overflowed onto the porch. I had just finished fixing a loose cabinet door when Margaret entered the kitchen with a bill in her hand. She set it down in front of me with a thud that made my spoon clatter against the bowl. "Dad," she said, arms folded tight, "you need to start paying more. The electricity, the groceries, the water. It's not fair that it all falls on me." I looked at her for a long moment, trying to read her face. There was no anger, not exactly. Just a cold certainty, like a verdict already delivered. "I pay what I can," I answered quietly. My pension wasn't large, but I gave her a portion each month without fail. Enough, I thought, to show I wasn't dead weight. "It's not enough," she said flatly. "Things are different now. Prices keep rising. You eat here, you use the heat, you live here. You should contribute the way a tenant would." The word hit me like a hammer. Tenant. I felt my chest tighten, though I kept my expression steady. "I'm not a tenant," I said. "I'm your father." She sighed, rolling her eyes as though I were being childish. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for fairness." Fairness. That word tasted bitter. Fairness had been giving her every dime I could spare when she was in college. Fairness had been working double shifts so she could have piano lessons, even though she quit after a year. Fairness had been sacrificing weekends, vacations, and comfort so she would never know hunger. And now fairness meant treating me like a stranger renting space under her roof. I wanted to tell her all of this, to lay my heart bare and make her see the cruelty in her words. But something in her expression told me it would fall on deaf ears, so I simply nodded, stood up, and walked away from the table. Sometimes silence speaks louder than protest, but that night, lying in bed, I could not silence the echo of her words. Tenant, burden, guest. They wrapped around me like chains, heavy and unyielding. I stared into the dark, listening to the rain ease against the windows, and wondered how the girl who once clung to my hand could now look at me as if I were a debt to be collected. The seeds were planted. I didn't yet know how deep their roots would go, but I could feel them spreading. Margaret's patience had curdled into entitlement, and entitlement, once fed, always grows hungry for more. The ultimatum came on a Saturday morning, sharp and final as a slammed door. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread before me, when Margaret walked in with a look I'd learned to dread. Her jaw was tight, lips pressed into a line, her robe cinched as though she needed armor for what she was about to say. She didn't bother with small talk, didn't pour her coffee, didn't even look at me until the words were already halfway out. "Dad, this can't go on. Either you start paying proper rent this month, or—" She hesitated, but only for effect. "Or you'll have to find somewhere else to live." The words landed like stones. I stared at her, the air thick in my lungs, the paper trembling in my hands. Rent. She had said it plain now, without euphemism, without softening. My own daughter, standing in her kitchen, telling me to pay or pack. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. That age had dulled my ears, or that fatigue had clouded her tongue. But her gaze was steady, and the silence stretched too long for there to be any mistake. "You mean to throw me out?" My voice was steady, though my insides quaked. She shrugged, eyes flicking away. "I'm not throwing you out. I'm just saying you need to pull your weight. Everyone pays rent, Dad. It's not personal, not personal." The phrase burned. If anything in this life is personal, it's blood. It's the bond between parent and child, forged in nights of worry and decades of sacrifice. But to her it had become a ledger, credits and debits, fairness measured in currency. I set the paper down slowly, forcing my hands to still. "Margaret," I said, my voice low, "I gave you everything I had when you were young. I worked myself raw to make sure you never went without. I didn't count pennies then. I counted your smiles." Her expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "That was then. This is now. Times are different, Dad. If you can't afford it, maybe there's a retirement home that can take you in." Retirement home? Like I was a crate of old tools to be stored away once they'd lost their shine. I didn't answer. Words would have been wasted. Instead, I studied her face, the same face that once lit up with joy when I returned home from work, the same face my wife used to kiss goodnight. It was there, but behind it was something else. Calculation, impatience, the cold efficiency of someone who had decided sentiment was a luxury. My chest ached, but not from weakness of age. It was grief, sharp and raw, for something still alive, but already lost. I spent the rest of that morning in silence. Margaret bustled about the house, making phone calls, laughing too loudly at things I couldn't hear. I sat in my chair by the window, staring at the oak tree in the yard. I had planted it myself 40 years ago, when Margaret was still small enough to ride on my shoulders. Its branches now stretched tall and strong, roots deep in the soil. It had outlasted my wife, outlasted my strength, and, I feared, outlasted my daughter's love. The humiliation of her words gnawed at me. A father turned into a tenant, a man who had built homes, reduced to begging for a corner of one. But beneath the hurt, another feeling stirred, quiet, steady, and colder than grief. Resolve. Because what Margaret didn't know, what she had never bothered to ask, was that the deed to this house, her house as she called it, was not in her name alone. Years ago I had insured my place. I had put my name where it could not be erased with a shrug or a sigh. I had no plan yet, no scheme or speech prepared. But as the morning turned to noon, I felt the first hint of power shift. She thought she held the ground beneath my feet. She thought she could turn me into a renter of my own bloodline. She was wrong. That night, lying awake, I let the anger cool into something sharper. Not rage, but strategy. Not a roar, but a whisper of steel. The betrayal had been revealed in full daylight, leaving no doubt of her intentions. And now I would begin to shape my response. The first crack had appeared not in me, but in her certainty. She had no idea what kind of foundations she was standing on, or how easily they could shift beneath her feet. I rose early the next morning before the house stirred. The sky was a pale gray, and the oak outside stood still against the damp air. My daughter's words still rang in my head. Pay this month or pack up. It was no longer anger I felt, but something steadier. Betrayal cuts deep, but wisdom teaches you not to bleed where your enemy can see. I made myself coffee, black and strong, and sat for a while in the silence. Then, at 9 o'clock sharp, I left the house. Margaret was still asleep. She'd been out late the night before, her laughter echoing down the hall long after I'd gone to bed. She thought she had time, that her verdict over me was final. But she didn't know the ground beneath her was already shifting. The walk to the solicitor's office was slow, but deliberate. Every step seemed to strip away a little more of the humiliation that had clung to me since her ultimatum. The streets were damp, the air smelled of rain-soaked stone, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The solicitor, Mr. Carter, had known me for decades. We shook hands, his grip firm as ever, though his hair had gone white. "Edward," he said, studying my face, "you look like a man with something on his chest." "I do," I replied simply. "It's time to make a change to the deed." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't question me. "That's the mark of an old friend in this line of work. They know when not to pry." We went through the paperwork slowly, every signature precise, every line read aloud. By 9:30, the transfer was sealed. Ownership was out of Margaret's hands, resting in safer ones. Not mine directly. No, I was wiser than that. I had placed it with a trusted trustee, a man who owed me loyalty from years past. The house would remain under my protection, untouchable by Margaret's whims. By 10 o'clock, I was walking back home, the documents secure in my coat. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, like a man who had finally closed a door that had been banging in the wind. Margaret greeted me in the kitchen when I returned, hair still tousled, robe pulled tight. "Where have you been so early?" she asked, voice groggy but edged. "Out," I said. No explanation, no invitation for more. She frowned but let it pass. She thought she still had the upper hand. That amused me, though I kept my face blank. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade you can wield. By noon, the knock came. Firm, decisive. Margaret opened the door, expecting perhaps a delivery. Instead, she found Mr. Carter's assistant standing there with a folder in hand. "Good afternoon," the young man said politely. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Edward Holbrook, regarding the property transfer." "You'll want to read this." I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, watching as confusion spread across Margaret's face. She took the folder, skimmed the first page, and her expression faltered. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she turned to me, eyes sharp, voice trembling. "What is this?" I didn't rush my answer. I set down my cup, met her gaze, and spoke evenly. That, Margaret, is the record of who holds this house now. And it isn't you." Her face went pale. She flipped through the pages as if searching for some error, some loophole, but there was none. The ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she hadn't even seen the cracks forming. You can't do this," she stammered. "I already did," I said, "at 9 this morning, while you were still asleep." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. She looked at me as though I had turned into a stranger. Perhaps I had. Perhaps she had never known me as well as she thought. Inside, I didn't gloat. There was no joy in watching your own child's arrogance collapse. But there was justice. A quiet, necessary justice that reminded me I was not as powerless as she believed. She stormed into the living room, pacing, muttering under her breath. I let her go. I stayed in the kitchen, steady as the oak outside, letting the weight of the moment settle. The first battle was won, not with shouting or fists, but with a pen and the patience of a man who had lived long enough to know that revenge best served is calm and final. That night Margaret barely spoke to me. She shut her door with a force that rattled the frame, and her silence was thick with fury. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, knowing the real fight was only beginning. She wouldn't surrender so easily. But now I held the stronger ground, and for the first time in months I slept without bitterness pressing on my chest. Margaret didn't speak to me the next morning. She moved around the kitchen like a storm contained in human form, slamming drawers, banging plates, sighing so loudly it rattled the windows. The silence between us wasn't peace. It was a fuse burning down. By the third day, the explosion came. I was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes, when she stormed out onto the porch. Her arms were folded, and her voice carried the sharpness of someone who'd been rehearsing lines all night. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said. I set the shears down and straightened slowly, meeting her gaze. "I think I've done what needed to be done." Her lips twisted. "Needed? You humiliated me, Dad, in my own house. You went behind my back, and for what? To prove you still have some power left?" "This isn't about proving anything," I said. "It's about protecting what's mine, and what was never yours to gamble with." Her eyes flashed. "That's where you're wrong. I've kept this place running. I've paid the bills. I've carried the weight while you sit there, acting like some king on a throne. Don't talk to me about what's yours." I let her words hang in the air. "They were venom, yes, but venom only poisons if you swallow it. I chose not to." "You've mistaken sacrifice for entitlement," I said at last, my voice even. "I never asked you to carry me. I give what I can. And this house, this land, it was secured long before you ever took a bill to the post office." Her breath came hard, shallow. She stepped closer, her voice lowering into something colder. "Fine. If you want to play this game, then I'll make it unbearable for you here. Don't think I won't. You need me more than I need you." There it was, the heart of her arrogance laid bare. She still believed she held the reins, that her threats could bend me. I didn't flinch. I simply picked up the shears, clipped a dead bloom from the rose bush, and said, "We'll see." She turned on her heel and stormed back inside, the screen door slamming behind her. That night she tried a different approach. She knocked on my bedroom door, her voice softer, honeyed. "Dad? Can we talk?" I hesitated, then opened the door. She stepped in, all meek smiles and downcast eyes. "I overreacted," she said. "I've just been stressed." I didn't mean to sound so harsh the other day. Her words were sweet, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted, calculating, never quite meeting mine. I had raised her. I knew when she was playing a part. "I see," I said, sitting back on the edge of the bed. "And what is it you want, Margaret?" She blinked, feigning hurt. I just want us to be a family, to work together. Maybe if we revisited the deed, put both our names. There it was, the slip beneath the sugar. I shook my head slowly. No, Margaret, that chapter is closed. Permanently, the mask slipped. Her smile vanished, her lips tightening into a thin line. You're making a mistake, she snapped. One you'll regret. She left without another word, her footsteps pounding down the hall. The days that followed were war by attrition. She cut the heat lower than usual, knowing the cold bit sharper at my age. She forgot to buy certain groceries, leaving me with bare shelves. She played music loudly late at night, as if to remind me whose roof I lived under. Each move was petty, small-minded, but together they formed a campaign designed to wear me down. Yet I endured. I had weathered harder storms than this, wars of industry, nights of hunger, the death of my beloved wife. Margaret's cruelty, sharp though it was, felt almost childish in comparison. Still, the hurt lingered, not in the inconveniences, but in what they revealed. My own daughter, flesh of my flesh, saw me as an obstacle rather than a father. Betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through slammed doors and empty cupboards. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't see, was that every act of spite only steeled my resolve. She thought she was pushing me toward surrender. In truth, she was pushing me toward something far stronger. The day would come when her schemes collapsed under their own weight. And when it did, I would be ready. Margaret's spite only deepened in the weeks that followed. Her silence became sharp as broken glass, her presence in the house a constant storm cloud. Yet I endured. I kept to my routines: coffee at dawn, a slow walk around the garden, evenings with the radio murmuring in the corner. On the surface I was unchanged. Inside I was sharpening my patience like a blade. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had just returned from town with a small bag of groceries when I found Margaret at the table, papers spread before her. She didn't look up as I entered, but her pen scratched furiously across a form. "What are you working on?" I asked, setting the bag down. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said coolly. I said nothing, but my eyes caught the heading on one of the pages. Loan application. My stomach tightened. She wasn't just angry, she was plotting to leverage the house itself, no doubt, as collateral for debts I'd never see a dime of. By evening, the storm broke. She came to me with the papers in hand, her voice deceptively calm. "Dad, I've spoken to the bank. With the house in my name, I can refinance. It'll give us both breathing room, but I'll need your signature on a few things." There it was, the hook baited, the trap sprung. I took the papers gently, scanned the top sheet, and then placed them back on the table. "Margaret," I said evenly, "you should have checked the deed before you wasted your time." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The house isn't in your name." "Not anymore. It hasn't been since the morning you gave me your ultimatum." Her face froze. For a moment she looked as though she hadn't heard me. Then she laughed, sharp and humorless. "Don't be ridiculous. This house, this is mine. You're bluffing." I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out the certified copy Mr. Carter had given me. I laid it on the table, the official seal catching the light. "Read it." Her hand trembled as she lifted the paper. I watched her eyes dart across the lines, watched her color drain as she reached the words that confirmed the truth. Ownership had been transferred, secured beyond her reach. "No," she whispered. This can't be legal." "It's more than legal," I replied. "It's binding. Ironclad, you have no claim here. Not to the bricks, not to the land, not even to the mailbox out front. The house is under my protection, locked against any loan, any scheme, any desperate grasp." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. She set the paper down slowly, her hands curling into fists. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. I only ensured you couldn't drag me down with you." She glared at me, eyes wild, and for a heartbeat I saw the child she had once been, angry, frightened, undone by a boundary she could not cross. But that child was gone, buried beneath years of entitlement and bitterness. "You think this is over?" she spat. "You think you can just outmaneuver me like I'm some stranger?" "I'm your daughter." I met her gaze, unflinching. "And that used to mean something, but blood doesn't give you the right to strip me of dignity. It doesn't give you the right to treat me as a burden. You forced my hand, Margaret. You left me no choice." Her lips quivered, but no words came. She turned away, pacing the room like a caged animal, muttering under her breath. I remained still, calm, the weight of years anchoring me where she could not shake me. That night I heard her weeping in her room. The sound should have broken me. It would have, once. But instead I felt only the solemnity of justice. I had protected what mattered most, my legacy, my place, the proof that I was not disposable. It was not victory I felt, but release. The chains of her ultimatum, the humiliation of her contempt, they had fallen away. She could rage, she could weep, she could plot all she liked. None of it mattered any more. The house, the land, the life I had built, it was safe, sealed against her hands. The second twist was not in the paperwork itself, but in what it revealed, that she was powerless now, not me. The game was no longer hers to play, and though I did not relish her downfall, I would not grieve it either. Some lessons come only through loss. The air in the house grew heavy after that night. Margaret moved like a shadow, silent most hours, then bursting with sudden anger when our paths crossed. I carried myself as I always had, slow, steady, deliberate. But inside, I knew we were building toward something final. A storm doesn't hover forever. It breaks. It happened 3 days later. She cornered me in the living room, her voice sharp, her eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. "Dad," she snapped, "we need to settle this once and for all. You think you've won, but you haven't. This is still my home. You're the guest here, and don't you forget it." I looked up from the armchair, the same chair I had sat in the day we brought her home from the hospital, the day her mother first placed her in my arms. Strange how memories insist on intruding even in the middle of war. "No," I said quietly, "this isn't your home. Not anymore. You tried to turn me into a tenant, Margaret. You threatened to throw me out. That's when you lost it, not just the house, but my trust." Her jaw tightened. "You can't just erase me. I've lived here, I've paid the bills, Bills fade," I interrupted. My voice had an edge now, years of silence giving way to steel. "But betrayal lingers. You tried to turn your own father into a man begging for scraps. That's something money doesn't wash away." She flinched, but her pride forced her forward. "So what now? You want me gone? Is that it? Throw your own daughter out on the street just to prove a point?" Her words dripped accusation, but her eyes were desperate. She was beginning to realize the walls had closed in, that her threats had no teeth left. "I don't want you gone," I said, "but I won't live under your thumb. You wanted power, Margaret, and now you've seen what happens when you abuse it. This house is no longer yours to gamble with. You can stay if you choose, but you'll stay as my daughter, not as my landlord." The silence stretched between us, taut as a rope ready to snap. Her chest heaved, her face flushing crimson. Then came the words I'd known she was holding back. "You're selfish," she spat. "All those years, you made it seem like you sacrificed everything for me. But this shows the truth. You only care about control. You never trusted me." Her accusation stung, but only for a moment. Then I felt the clarity of age settle over me, heavy and grounding. "I trusted you," I said, my voice firm. "I trusted you with my years, with my care, with the love of a father who gave without question. And you repaid that trust with an ultimatum. You told me to pay or pack. You turned me into a stranger in my own blood's house. That's not me failing trust, Margaret. That's you breaking it." Her eyes shimmered, though whether with tears or fury I couldn't tell. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. The silence said what her pride could not admit. She knew the truth of my words. I rose slowly from the chair, each movement deliberate, as though to mark the weight of the moment. "This is the last time we'll speak of it. The house is secured. My place here is secured. If you stay, it's under those terms. If you leave, that's your choice. But you will never again hold this roof over my head as a weapon." For a long moment she just stood there, trembling, caught between rage and defeat. Then she turned away, her voice hoarse. "You've made your bed, Dad. Don't expect me to lie in it." She stormed down the hall, the slam of her door echoing like a gunshot. I sank back into the chair, my heart heavy, but not with doubt. It was the heaviness of a man who had carried something long past its weight. For the first time since my wife's passing, I felt the ground firm beneath me. The final confrontation had ended not with shouting, but with clarity. I had drawn the line, and she had seen it. Whatever came next, distance, coldness, or silence, it would be on her terms, not forced on mine. The betrayal had reached its end, and in that end I found my dignity restored. The house grew quieter after that night. Margaret spoke little, her footsteps softer, her presence less commanding. It was not reconciliation, far from it, but the battles had ended. A strange peace settled in, not born of harmony, but of boundaries at last respected. I spent more time in the garden. The roses bloomed despite the frost in the air, their petals fragile yet stubborn, clinging to life as if to remind me that beauty endures even in harsh seasons. Some mornings I would sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the oak sway, and I felt a steadiness return that I hadn't known in years. Margaret still carried herself with pride, but it was a wounded pride. She no longer slid bills across the table or sighed when I poured my tea. She had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that her power had limits. And in that limit I found space to breathe again. Her son, my grandson, noticed the shift, though he didn't understand it fully. One afternoon he asked, "Grandpa, are you and Mom mad at each other?" I smiled faintly, ruffling his hair. "Sometimes families argue," I said. "Sometimes they forget how much they mean to each other. But the important thing is to remember who you are, and never let anyone take that from you." He nodded, the answer enough for now, and ran off to play. Watching him, I felt both sorrow and hope. Sorrow that his mother had lost sight of the love that raised her. Hope that perhaps in him the chain could be reforged. In the evenings, alone in my room, I often thought of my wife. I imagined her sitting beside me, her hand resting on mine, her voice calm as always. "You did what you had to do," she would have said, and she would have been right. For all the grief it caused, securing the deed was not about revenge, it was about dignity, about ensuring that the years I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, were not erased by the ingratitude of a single voice. There were nights when loneliness pressed hard. Betrayal leaves scars deeper than anger. It hollows you. I had once believed that love within blood was unshakable. Now I knew better. Trust can fracture, even in the closest bonds. But wisdom comes with knowing when to stop mending what another keeps breaking. I did not throw Margaret out. I never would. She remained under this roof, not because she held power, but because I still believed in mercy. Yet mercy does not erase consequence. She lived now with the knowledge that her ultimatum had cost her the very control she craved. That was the justice life had written for her. For me, the victory was quieter. It was in the mornings when I brewed coffee without dread of her footsteps. It was in the evenings when I turned the key in the front door and knew the lock was secure, not against intruders, but against betrayal. It was in the simple act of being able to sit in my chair, gaze at the oak, and know I was no man's tenant, not even my daughter's. One night, weeks later, Margaret lingered in the doorway of the kitchen while I washed my cup. She looked tired, her face drawn. For a moment, I thought she might speak an apology, but she said nothing. She only watched me, her lips parting and closing again, before she turned and left. I dried the cup, placed it on the shelf, and let the silence be. Some words, once unspoken, hang heavier than those shouted in anger. Now, as I sit here, pen in hand, writing these words for no one but myself, I see the truth laid bare. Betrayal does not come only from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the faces you once trusted most. And when it does, you are left with a choice, to surrender to it or to stand against it with whatever strength remains. I chose to stand. The cost was high, love fractured, trust broken, but my legacy remained intact. My dignity remained my own. And perhaps one day Margaret will look back and see the weight of what she lost. But whether she does or not, I am at peace, because betrayal may arrive quietly, like a splinter under the skin. But consequence comes knocking just as surely.